So there's been a lot of debate in the last week or so since the Game of the Year awards nominations were revealed. And a lot of them center around what should define an indie game. There was, of course, the news of one of the developers of an indie game. He removed himself from consideration for a debut indie game because he had previously made games as a solo developer and he felt that it wasn't right. So he withdrew his game from consideration. What was the name of that game? Megabonk. Thank you, Megabonk. So it was a topic of conversation. And there was an article that was submitted by one of you lovely folk over on our member and sub-only Discord. Shadow posted this. Apparently an indie studio supported by a small publisher isn't considered an indie, and submitted this article for me to look at on stream. It is from the one and only Kotaku, where they say there's just no way Clair Obscur Expedition 33 should be up for Indie Game Awards. The multi-million-dollar game has entered itself into multiple indie awards, which doesn't feel right. I will say, the term indie has gotten thrown around a lot because I think, in my view, and please let me know in chat what your definition of indie would be, but in my view, an indie game is like a small independent studio. When I say small, I'm thinking like 50 or under in terms of employee count. Once you get above that, I start to think like AA. I think like, okay, you got some money behind you to be able to employ like 80 people. But I'm thinking like below 50 people, independent, so you're not owned by a major publisher. You could partner with a publisher to distribute your game. You don't need to just self-publish. But I think of specifically the size of the team and the budget that we're dealing with. That's typically what I think of. That's what I think of, at least. A studio not backed by a larger publisher. The question is, here was not indie, but debut. People seem to miss that. Back with the Megabonk thing. Yeah, absolutely. This, though, is specifically over the topic of being indie or not. The perennial discussion of what constitutes an indie game is both tired and tiring. It's a term that, in the end, no longer means anything at all. And as such, the fights over what is allowed to call itself one are mostly futile. It's best left alone. But then along come the annual awards reserved specifically for whatever an indie game actually is. And suddenly the whole contentious topic is thrown into a harsh light, along with which comes a realization. You may not be able to say what an indie game is, but you can sure say what it isn't. And that would include a multi-million-dollar game made by hundreds of people. And this is a common thing that's come up with Expedition 33 a number of times. There are some false narratives or misconceptions, maybe is more appropriate, around Expedition 33. For example, the narrative started going around that this was a studio made up of just 33 developers that were former Ubisoft developers that left, and they wanted to make this game at Ubisoft, but Ubisoft, were crushing their creativity. So they left, made their own studio, and did this. It's a good story. Sort of like pieces of it are true. It is a small studio, but only like 2 or 3 of the developers ever worked at Ubisoft. It was like the founder, I believe, technical director, I want to say. He was also working, ironically enough, he worked at Ubisoft at the studio that is currently still working on Beyond Good and Evil 2. So he has some connection to that game, which people don't even know if it exists anymore. But there were like a few of them worked at Ubisoft, but most of the team that made this had no connection to video games before this. They were fresh out of school, or they were modders. They did not have a lot of exposure to Ubisoft or the games industry or anything. So like that narrative's not quite true. And one of the other pieces that's been built up is that it was just 33 people that put together this thing that competes against AAA studios in tons of different ways. It's not quite accurate, as I'm thinking they're going to break down, because it was a little bit more involved than that. Yeah, yesterday the Excellent Indie Game Awards announced their list of finalists. It's a fantastic ceremony that not only champions the very best indies in gaming, but also shines a light on minority developers, highlights the work of solo devs, and pushes for greater accessibility in video games. It's also now in the awkward situation of having a grand prize category that is pitching the 5-person created Consume Me against the behemoth of Clair Obscur Expedition 33. So yeah, we're having that argument again. And this is the difficulty where it's like a studio of 5 people competing against like Hades 2 or Silk Song or Expedition 33. I'd say all of these are very tough to compete against, certainly, but that's just the nature of the beast. What is an indie game would be, it's an independent game, a game without a publisher. And for a while, that was certainly what it's meant to be, but not anymore. The thing is, nowadays, I don't think publisher, I think a lot of people would think it's without an owner. Like, you're not part of a larger organization. You're an independent studio. Maybe they mean publisher, but for years and years and years, if you were an indie studio, you still needed a publisher to distribute your games, especially globally. But I also feel like there's an insinuation of size and scope, that you're not a big studio. In the music industry in the 1990s, indie irreversibly went from meaning an album or single not published by a major record label to a genre of music. So-called independent labels grew enormously successful from their bands becoming mainstream, and many were bought up by the big five at the time, majors, while listening audiences didn't care one iota about any of it. They just liked the music, and as a result, indie music went from a distinction to a vibe. Almost the same process has occurred in video games, albeit 20 years later. That's a really good distinction and way of, or connection. It's good connection, because it is a very similar vibe, where it used to be like 5 people sitting in a basement building something together, but now it's like, it's just not AAA, man. It's not big, I certainly get that. There was a brief window in the late 2000s when indie games were very definitively a specific thing. Digital publishing suddenly made it possible to distribute a game without going to or through a publisher. A better development tools meant small teams or individuals were able to create impressive games. But when I name an excellent example of such an indie game, you might detect the beginnings of the problem: Minecraft. As indie gaming became a phenomenon, publishers sprung up and swooped in. There was a lot of money in those hills. Those thar hills is the proper way of saying it. And there were people who could help solo and small teams find the finances they need to get games across the finish line, as well as hooking them up with distribution to digital stores, marketing, and PR. The games were still being created the same way by the same numbers of people with the same vibes, but so often now had a very not independent structure around them. At the same time, others just uploaded their scrappy project to Steam and hoped, and a few caught fire. When Massive got rich, they were all received as indie games, and oftentimes the genuinely independent developers would then become the publishers for the next generation, using their recent successes, contacts, and finances to try and provide similar opportunities for others. They'd push on those heavy doors and now wanted to hold it open for others, which is brilliant, but it also helped the term indie make less and less sense. I'm sensing that the frustration is going to basically come down to the vibe outlined at the very, very start, which is that you have a team of 5 people competing against a team of 33, plus a lot of, like, many millions of dollars to go and hire contracted work and other people to help, or a game like Silksong, which had basically an open blank check from all sorts of different groups who would want to fund the development of the game, let them work on it as long as they wanted to. And that just feels bad. It feels like they're not in the same category, which is true. But I mean, it's just the nature of the beast. If you're like, yeah, it's an indie company, your indie company is tiny, mine is massive, but it's still independent, like Robert Space Industries, the guys behind Star Citizen, they are technically independent. They've raised close to $900 million, but they are technically independent. They have more employees than most AAA development studios, but they're technically an indie studio because they're not connected to anything else and they're totally independent. So it's like, that's why I feel when I think indie, I'm thinking that there's a certain budget or employee count limitation, Yeah, Larian is also independent, exactly, but would the average person call Larian an indie studio? Probably not. Yeah, but you could argue Silksong's budget was in the hundreds of millions, but we have no way to know. I mean, I don't think it's in the hundreds of millions. I think it, because the teams just isn't that big. Silksong at least is a tiny studio. Hades is the developers at Supergiant. I think they're also not that big either. But the point is, like, they are independent, but I think at some point there should be a cutoff, at least in terms of sentiment. A lot of people call Larian indie. Yeah, well, I feel Larian is more indie in vibe than like Robert Space Industry is with Star Citizen after raising close to $1 billion. But I think that's like part of the point, is that indie has sort of become a vibe, and the definition is really loose, because if it's literally just an independent studio, you have to include like Robert Space Industries, which just feels off. It feels strange to do that. And so that like gut vibe suggests maybe there should be another tidbit, another asterisk next to it, like tiny indie game, tiny indie studio of less than 50 people. Maybe that's a category. I don't know if that's even worth it. Continuing on, as I said at the start, for the majority of the time, this is all semantics. But for the average person playing games, it just isn't important. Yes, you might care, but I said the average person. Whether the roguelike deck builder RPG you're playing was made by a team of 2 or a team of 200 matters very little when you're sitting on your couch having a great time. It's very true. But that distinction, that ambiguity of the term, does suddenly start to matter very much when it comes to handing out awards. True, especially when those awards bring with them acolytes, opportunities, business opportunities, all of that. No, I totally agree. Rewards and award ceremonies are generally a bane on existence, where the already most successful products get given prizes for having already succeeded, while incredible achievements that went unrecognized remain just as obscure. It sucks. I hate to destroy them all. But when it comes to indie game awards, I have a different perspective, because at their very best, they can bring unknown games alongside the year's breakout successes, the latter helping bring eyes to the former. Events like IGFS at GDC, the IGAs, do wonders for bringing attention to those who have so far gone unnoticed, pushing tiny, peculiar games into the limelight. This not only benefits those games, their developers, and the people who end up enjoying them, but also wider gaming itself, as their oddities and nuances influence others and expand people's scope for what games can be. It's all brilliant, unless, of course, a multi-million-dollar game sneaks its way in on a technicality that pushes less known games out of the way, which I think is true. Clair Obscur Expedition, here's where we get into the nitty-gritty. Clair Obscur Expedition 33's budget is not certain, but various informed estimates put it between $15 and $25 million, likely towards the higher end. While the core team at Sandfall is relatively small, 30 to 40 people, I believe the official number is 33 and a dog. It was a game whose leadership hired literally hundreds of contractors to work on it too. And I do not believe that anyone who is applying reasonable thought could consider this to be what is understood as an indie game. I do think it starts to feel weird when you have a team of 33, which does pass the indie vibe check, but then you find out that they also hired 300 people to help. And then you're like, yeah, that feels weird. It's like if you say, yeah, I'm a startup indie artist, startup. But then you find out that like your best friend's dad is actually a record producer and has worked with like Justin Bieber, and you got to record your album in his recording studio and he helped produce it. It's like, you technically are independent. You are not signed with anybody, but you got access to a tool that no one else has who's independent, it starts to feel weird. And this was why initially when Expedition 33 came out, there was a lot of discourse around, like, again, the narrative was good. The story of 33 people left Ubisoft, made this game, and it's amazing. That story was so good that it just started to carry and spread through social media, but it wasn't actually true. It's like, yeah, it's 30 people. Like 3 of them were from Ubisoft. Most of them are new to gaming. And they had a lot of money because they did present this amazing idea, these great prototypes to the publisher, Kepler, and they said, we need some money to get it across the finish line. They got lots of money because they had a lot of confidence in the project and faith in the project, knowing that it was going to be great because it looked great and clearly there was a lot of potential there. So they gave them tons of money to hire contractors to build it out and accomplish this. And it worked out great, but looking just at like the 33 developers is probably not indicative, of what actually happened. There used to be a widely accepted term for games like this, AA. AA games were those that essentially fell in the middle between an indie game, as it's understood, and a AAA big budget game published by the likes of Ubisoft, EA, or Activision. Again, there's no sharply defined line to be drawn in the sand, but it sure should help to have the AA category there to stop games that cost less than $300 million from claiming to be indie. Expedition 33 is the platonic AA game. It had a multi-million-dollar budget and a core team counted in tens and not ones, but wasn't on the scale of some of the big name rivals. And there I'm being fairly generous, given that the number of names on the credits absolutely does match that of plenty of EA games, especially when you count specifically when you count the contractors. And this, I don't know how many contractors worked on like KCD2, but it may actually be the case that like more individual people touched Expedition 33 when you count the contractors than touched KCD2, which would be crazy. So then, given all this, how on earth does a game like Expedition 33 end up appearing in an indie game awards? Well, to give the quick answer, it's by entering itself on a technicality and hoping to get away with it. But for a more complicated answer, I reached out to organizations, the organizations of the IGAs, I can't read, organizers of the IGAs, to find out more from them. As you might suspect, says Mike Towndrow, creative director and at organizers for 601 Indie Showcase, quote, "It's been an ongoing and sometimes painful, conversation with the curation jury since launch." And basically, like, I think with all this, it's tricky because games like Expedition 33, people agree, deserve celebration and deserve laudation and prizes and awards and everything. But if it means that they, with a big budget and with lots of developers, are taking recognition away from some of those smaller teams that didn't have all of those benefits and assets, then what's the point of the indie award? Because it basically just becomes AA awards. Because what one of those smaller games is going to beat Expedition 33 or Hades 2, like, or Silk Song? Like, probably nothing, even though each of those games probably fits more into that like AA category. Some people in the comments try to counter. Your argument focuses on size and available resources, which I think is an argument that's played out again and again in other media, but distracts from the bigger issue. Expedition 33's independence is what allows the game to succeed as it does creatively, from the setting to the story to the art to the music. Some of its odd mechanics, very little about this game would have survived the traditional risk-averse AAA system. It walks and talks like a AAA game, but its bleeding heart is indie. I do think that this is a genuinely interesting point, because it's basically like, yeah, resources are great, money's great, but it's the creative freedom that you get by being independent that is the spirit of the award. The money helps. The money certainly helps, but the creative spirit is what carries forward and is what you're ultimately awarding. And I love that vibe and I love that point, but I don't think you can just wholeheartedly ignore the budget and production benefits, you know, because I as much as I love the idea that it is all about ideas, it's also about having the time and resources to let the devs build and finish what you want them to do. You know, that's I think the key part. So I agree with the vibe of the question, or of the counter, where it's that the independent award is specifically targeting like the creative freedom and independence, but I don't think you can just ignore the budget side of it. I think you answer your own question in the post. Expedition 33 shows one way to make indie games. It's a rare way, it's kind of a miracle, but it is a way. Most indie games are made in other ways, and so other categories exist to honor and reward games made in those ways. But to deny Expedition 33 its indie honors because the team should have had to struggle more is to unnecessarily exclude types of independent development and certain creative styles, which I'd argue is actually more against the spirit of indie development than, say, the capital they raised. I mean, I think all of this really at the end of the day is that the author of this article is frustrated that this independent studio, which is what they are, went and raised a bunch of money to go and build a bigger independent game than they would have been able to make otherwise. By doing that, they then enter into a separate category, which most commonly is referred to as AA, and they think that there should not be, if you're AA, you're not indie, so you shouldn't be able to win indie awards. Difficulty being, you have to have some sort of guideline, some sort of standard to be able to say that, like, when you have a budget over 10 million, you're no longer indie. And that would be like a moving goalpost, because over time, with inflation, that would have to shift and change. Like, does that change based on where you are in the world? Because in certain areas of the world, 10 million goes a lot farther or a lot shorter, you know? But I think everybody is sort of right here. Would I call Expedition 33 a classical, typical indie game? No, because it did have tens of millions of dollars behind it, most likely, with hundreds of contracted workers helping make it happen. That certainly helps. Certainly helps. I think that commenter is right that the creative spirit, being independent, allowed them to do things you wouldn't have been able to do otherwise if you were in a more traditional format, and that also deserves recognition and praise, but that still puts it in that AA category. Ultimate solution, and what I'd be happy with, is to just have a AA category, AA award show, if you could even do that. But I think if you do something like that, that goes a lot farther. Otherwise, you end up with, I think it was it Lies of P? I think it was, that was also nominated for Indie Game of the Year, even though like Lies of P was not an indie game at all. Like not even close, but it was nominated for Indie Game of the Year at the Game Awards. I believe that was right. I think you gotta split it. Gotta split it off.
He took my thing.